So once we've got sensitive areas taken care of, we want to shift gears and talk a little bit about what compatible crops and susceptible crops may be nearby and in adjacent fields. So compatible crops would be crops that do not have a downwind adjacent field buffer when applying Enlist herbicides. So what this means is the wind can be blowing from 3 to 10 miles an hour in the direction of that compatible crop in an adjacent field, and we can still make that application. And examples of those would be corn, peanuts, rice, grain sorghum or milo, soybeans with or without the Enlist trait, which is significant here in the Mid-South with the number of soybean acres we have, and then wheat as well. So if you've got any of these crops in an adjacent field or potentially surrounding your Enlist field, as long as the wind speed is within the labeled range, you can make an application with the wind blowing in that direction. The crops we have to be careful around would be susceptible crops. And the main one here in the Mid-South that we have to worry about would be cotton without the Enlist trait. So if you have cotton without the Enlist trait in an adjacent field, you cannot make an application if the wind is blowing in that direction. Now again, this is a wind directional buffer, so if the wind is blowing away from that susceptible crop, we can spray right up to the field edge. So that does give us an opportunity when wind direction changes to go in and make that application. But again, if we've got cotton without the Enlist trait in an adjacent field and the wind is blowing in that direction, we do not make an application on that day. All right, so we just talked a little bit about field season, pre-season field planning, and now I want to walk through some specific examples that I run into in the field where we've got compatible crops that are planted in and around Enlist crops and what that enables from a freedom to spray standpoint. So here we have a very common cropping system in the Mid-South and even more so as you move out into the Southeast and potentially some in Texas, and that would be a peanut and cotton rotation. So as we mentioned earlier, peanuts are a compatible crop. There is no downwind buffer to peanuts. So if you have peanuts in an adjacent field, you can spray Enlist herbicides over the top of Enlist cotton or Enlist soybeans and not have to worry about off-target movement into these peanuts, because peanuts are inherently very tolerant to 2,4-D. Now, the flip side of that is a very common broadleaf herbicide used in peanuts is Buterac, or 2,4-DB. And this product can be sprayed in peanuts, and it could drift onto Enlist cotton, and the AAD12 trait that confers tolerance in Enlist cotton actually can metabolize Buterac or 2,4-DB. Now that herbicide is not labeled for use in Enlist cotton, but again, it gives us safety whether we're spraying our peanuts up next to our Enlist cotton or spraying our Enlist cotton up next to our peanuts. And it's also a great advantage when it comes to tank cleanout, because it really does help give peace of mind to a grower knowing that once I've cleaned my sprayer and I'm going back into my peanut crop or my cotton crop, I'm not going to have to worry as much about tank contamination versus what we may see with some other herbicide systems that aren't compatible in these two crops. So we just transitioned from the cotton and peanut compatibility stop to now we're going to talk about compatibility between Enlist cotton, or this could be Enlist soybeans as well, and grain sorghum. Now grain sorghum is a crop we don't grow much of in the Mid-South anymore, but when I used to work in South Texas, it's a big rotational partner down there, and even as you move up into West Texas as well. So a lot of grain sorghum and cotton grown in very close proximity. And just like we talked about the compatibility before with peanuts and Enlist cotton, we've got great compatibility here as well. So Enlist 1 is 2,4-D choline, and 2,4-D amine, which is basically the same chemical structure, is actually a labeled herbicide for use in grain sorghum. So there's a lot of 2,4-D amine that gets sprayed for broadleaf weed control in grain sorghum. And again, the AAD12 trait that confers tolerance to Enlist in Enlist cotton can metabolize 2,4-D amine. Now again, 2,4-D amine is not labeled for use in Enlist crops, but the cotton plant can tolerate it. And so that gives us a really nice compatibility where if we're spraying Enlist 1, which is 2,4-D, we don't have to worry about crop response on grain sorghum. And vice versa, if we're spraying 2,4-D amine on grain sorghum, we don't have to worry about crop response on our Enlist cotton. Another very commonly used herbicide in grain sorghum, especially when we move up into panhandle of Texas where we've got kochia issues, would be Starrain, Ultra, or fluroxapyr. And again, Enlist cotton does metabolize or can tolerate fluroxapyr. So even though that herbicide is not labeled for use in Enlist cotton, if you have a little bit of off-target movement from an application in the grain sorghum, you're not going to have any issues in your cotton. And again, if we're spraying Enlist herbicides in cotton, not any issues on the grain sorghum. The one thing I would tell people to be aware of in this scenario is if you do have a tank mix partner with your Enlist 1, such as glyphosate, then obviously grain sorghum is susceptible to glyphosate, so we would have to be careful there. So be mindful of your tank mix partners because that could change when and where you can make an application, and always refer to the most restrictive label in that scenario. So we just talked about grain sorghum and Enlist cotton and the compatibility there. Now we're going to talk about another grass crop and compatibility with another broadleaf, and this would be Enlist soybeans with rice. And this is a big deal where I come from in South Louisiana, a big deal as we move into Arkansas, where we've got a tremendous number of rice acres, and their most common rotation with rice would be soybeans. So in rice, again, we use several auxin herbicides for broadleaf weed control, two of those being 2,4-diamine, which we just discussed on the sorghum stop, and also grandstand or triclopyr. Enlist soybeans contain the same herbicide-tolerant trait that we see in cotton, AAD12, and again, this confers tolerance, or it will metabolize triclopyr and 2,4-diamine. So again, that gives us tremendous safety. Even though those herbicides are not labeled for use in soybeans, we can spray a rice field adjacent to Enlist E3 soybeans and not have to worry about any off-target movement damaging these soybeans. Likewise, again, if we're spraying Enlist 1 on our Enlist E3 soybeans, that's going to be safe around rice because, again, 2,4-D herbicide is labeled for use in rice, although it's just a different formulation than what we would use with Enlist. So again, very good compatibility here. Again, the same watch out for we talked about earlier. If you're applying a tank mix partner such as glyphosate with your Enlist 1, then we would definitely want to be careful because obviously rice is susceptible to glyphosate. So again, when tank mixing, make sure that you abide by your most restrictive tank mix partner label. All right, the last stop on our crop compatibility tour today is going to be talking about the interface between Enlist corn and rice. And this is one I'm really excited about. We're going to be introducing Enlist corn hybrids in the Mid-South here in the next couple of years. And this is going to solve a big problem we have in those areas where we're growing corn up adjacent to rice, especially where we're trying to battle either some grass weeds in our rice crop or red rice. So earlier today we talked about the fact that Enlist corn confers tolerance to FOP herbicides, and there are several FOP herbicides that we spray today in rice. And in that scenario where we don't have Enlist corn adjacent, we have to really be careful about whether or not those FOP herbicides move off target onto non-Enlist corn. So the two FOP herbicides that I'm talking about would be Clincher or Sahalifop, or Previsia, or commonly known as Quizalifop. So again, Previsia or Quizalifop is the same active ingredient as Assure 2, which is going to be labeled for grass control over the top of Enlist corn. So when you've got these two crops in close compatibility and you're spraying either Clincher or Previsia over the top of rice, you don't have to worry about drift or off-target movement onto your corn. And again, because 2,4-D is labeled in rice, as we talked about at the stop with soybeans, if you're spraying Enlist 1 in your corn crop, it's going to be safe to use around rice. So in this stop today, we've talked about pre-season field planning and how important that is in terms of laying out what crops are in adjacent fields and what compatible crops such as rice, peanuts, or grain sorghum can do in terms of enabling the amount of opportunity you're going to have to make on-labeled applications of Enlist herbicides.